Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining us here today for what is such an important conversation for the trajectory of our democracy. I'm Philip Reiner. I'm the CEO and co-founder of the Institute for Security and Technology. This conversation, I think, as everyone on the call here today is aware, is such an important discussion. It couldn't come at a more critical time. What we're going to try to do today is to put into historical context while we talk about the immediate real-time environment of how information is weaponized and used for the purposes of political warfare. We have an absolutely fantastic group of speakers here with us today who will be able to get after these issues, I think, in a very operational, down in the weeds kind of way. We really look forward to your questions and answers as we go through this conversation here today. Just a quick word on who we are at the Institute for Security and Technology. We're a West Coast, San Francisco Bay Area based nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. Our mission is to bring together those who work on technology, who build products, who work in the technology industry, to bring those people together with security professionals and national security policymakers, to bring those two worlds together and try to come up with novel solutions to some of these incredibly complicated emerging security threats. Today's discussion is a perfect example of the types of things that we focus on. Really excited to dig into this with our speakers. I'm going to introduce Mike McNerney, who is our board chair and a co-founder of the organization, who's going to be leading the discussion here for us today. Mike, welcome, and turning things over to you.
Great, thank you, Phil. Thank you, everybody, for joining. This is an incredibly important topic, and certainly over the last couple of years has certainly risen in prominence. A topic that I think not a lot of people thought much about before the 2016 election, but a topic that we are really all discussing and trying to grapple with now. We have a great panel here today for you guys. They're going to go into the history of disinformation, what's going on today, what we can do to try to combat it. I think you're going to find largely that while disinformation isn't new necessarily, what we're seeing today is that technology has really enabled the spread and scale of disinformation at a level that we've never really seen before. And as a result, bad actors, be they foreign or domestic, have really ready access to the American people. Because, you know, on the internet, you're essentially no more than a fraction of a second away from anyone else in the world. And that can be either for good or for ill. So our panelists are really going to go into all of this history, the history of disinformation, the current activities that we're taking to counter it, as well as what the future might hold. And it's my hope that in the end, we'll be able to not only understand disinformation better, but also have some ideas about how we might better protect ourselves and protect our country. So I'm very much looking forward to the conversation. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panelists one at a time and allow them to have an opening remark. We're going to then move into a guided discussion period, and then we're going to open up for audience questions. So please do have those questions ready. The first panelist I'd like to introduce is Nell Thomas. Nell is the Chief Technology Officer of the Democratic National Committee. She's an expert in data science and analytics with terrific experiences working in several political campaigns, as well as market-leading companies like Etsy and Facebook. Nell, if you wouldn't mind opening up with a discussion about how you're thinking about disinformation and some of the steps that DNC is taking to work against it.
Absolutely. And I just want to start by saying that I'm honored to be here with you, Mike, and with Thomas and Vera. And a thank you to the Institute of Technology and Security. This is a really fantastic event. So to address the question of the DNC's approach to disinformation, I do obviously have to start back in 2016 to say that we know from the work of academics, researchers, and the intelligence community across the globe that in 2016, Russian intelligence services deployed active measures online to attack the American presidential election. And I'm excited to hear more about the history from the perspective of Thomas in particular. What I will say is that to address this reality and knowing that the current administration has not taken the threat seriously, the DNC established a counter disinformation unit within the technology team that I run that serves as a knowledge base and intelligence unit to aid Democratic campaigns, state parties, and party committees to combat online disinformation and social media manipulation. So first and foremost, we started by funding it. We built out a staff to address the threat. We've hired a fantastic Chief Security Officer, Bob Lord, formerly of Yahoo and Twitter, as well as analysts coming out of many of the social media companies. We've built tools and invested in partnerships that allow us to take a four-pronged approach to the threat of disinformation. The first of those prongs is detection monitoring, knowing what disinformation is out there and we need to be aware of. And that's through a combination of homegrown tools that we've built, as well as some of the best-in-class tools out there for social listening and detection. The second pillar is countermeasures. So once we know that there is a disinformation narrative, how do we counter it? And here we're namely focused on amplification of factual stories and positive stories that can counterbalance and hopefully drown out the disinformation that is rampant in some areas. The third pillar is education of the entire ecosystem, especially in the democratic side. We know that as with many types of both foreign and domestic interference, attacks are not limited on one organization. And therefore our role as the party infrastructure is broader than just protecting the DNC or our chairman, but really about how do we educate and up-level the wider ecosystem of democratic organizations. And the final pillar, that fourth one, is policy advocacy. I think that many of you might are aware and see how we are very much in a moment when there is not codified rules around how policies are written or enforced by social media companies. The threat of disinformation is much broader than social media companies alone, but they obviously the platforms play an active role in shaping what is and is not seen by the public. And so we have been trying very hard to outline the gaps in current policies, outline and escalate issues of inconsistent enforcement, and try to hasten what I'm sure will be a decades-long movement to really put in place, through a combination of consumer pressure, legislative pressure, and platform self-regulation, a more standard and a coherent set of policies around disinformation on social media platforms. So that in brief is the approach we've taken. Happy and excited to talk more about any of those specific initiatives in more detail.
Thanks, Nell. I think I will take you up on that offer later. You raised a couple things that I think are worth diving into, the role of tech companies, some of the partnerships, and then you alluded to something that I think maybe we all implicitly understand, which is this problem doesn't end on November 3rd, right? This is a problem that goes through January 20th and maybe beyond, certainly beyond. So I'd love to explore all of those a little bit later on in the panel. But if we could quickly turn over to our next panelist, Thomas Rid. Tom is a professor of strategic studies at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He's a prolific author, has written several books and publications, including his most recent entitled Active Measures, a terrific book. I highly recommend reading it for anybody interested in this topic. And it is a history and survey and deep discussion of disinformation in today. So Tom, if I could turn over to you and just maybe provide some of the groundwork for what we're talking about today. Some of the history of disinformation, if what we're seeing today is new, if not, why not? How is the U.S. Good at dealing with disinformation? And if not, why? What might be holding us back? So Tom, let me turn things over to you.
Yeah. So back in 2016, I'll also use 2016 as a starting point. I was investigating an older Russian hacking campaign from a digital forensics point of view, working with malware samples and log files and whatnot, old files that we were able to dig up. And when we were in the middle, me and my team, of investigating that case, the DNC, what became known somewhat misleadingly actually as the DNC hack, became public in mid-June 2016. And when that became public in that famous now CrowdStrike story in the Washington Post and post on their website, everybody I work with in the wider InfoSec community immediately knew what we were looking at because the forensic indicators were so strong. There was no doubt that we were looking at a Russian intrusion. That was simply not even a question. And I would add here that it was even not, I was working at the time with, and even they understood what was going on. There was no doubt. Then the leaking started a day later. And very quickly, it also became clear that that is part of the same operation. Because again, the evidence literally on that day was very strong already and only became stronger as more days passed. So we're looking at days here, not weeks or months. The US intelligence community was really absent for too long, did not act appropriately. I think they learned their lesson and they're much more proactive this year, this election season around. But what really changed my view on this subject was not seeing the forensics. I quickly understood I was not equipped to understand the history of this kind of operation. So I started reading up on deception, disinformation, and measures. Started talking to operators who are still alive, old men, all of them. And, from Stasi, from KGB, from Czech intelligence, Czechoslovak intelligence. That was the eye-opener for me. Because when you hear, some of the perennial dynamics of disinformation operations articulated by people who made a career doing it, it just drives home the art and science of disinformation in a way that looking at the digital exhaust does not. So let me give you one of the insights that I think takes us to a very controversial question straight away. And just to say, the history is so rich. We're looking at a century with thousands of case studies. And initially I thought, can I really write a long book on the history of disinformation? Very quickly it became clear that I have to leave out so much content because it was impossible to get everything in. And when I say history, I mean archival sources, as well as memoirs and interviews. I don't mean suspicions and assessments, but I mean the actual files and memos from the people who are running the operations. So if you look at those files, you see that they encountered a measurement problem. And this is something that I encountered in interviews with former operators as well. Because think about it. A disinformation operation is usually taking advantage of an existing thing, an existing crack in society, an existing racial prejudice, whatever it is, and then exacerbate or try to exacerbate that existing raw material. Of course, that raises a tough question if you're the operator. What is your own doing and what was happening organically? For example, if you're giving additional lift to a conspiracy theory that is already out there, you can't really measure how effective you were as opposed to how effective the conspiracy theory was on its own. So that measurement problem leads to a self-perpetuating type of activity, because human nature is that we exaggerate how good we are. That applies to people who run disinformation operations, applies to academics like myself, applies to all of us really. They were getting more money and they were able to essentially escalate. Today, if you look at, and that's the question I want to leave you with, if we look at this big question, what is really new? Because many of the tactics are not new. Racial engineering, amplifying conspiracy theories, hacking and leaking, all that we've seen many, many times in the past. What is really new today is, I think, that it's not just the perpetrators who exaggerate their impact. It's the victim, society, that exaggerates their impact as well. So the degree to which disinformation, or let me be more specific, the degree to which the conversation about disinformation has become a sting, a vector of effect by itself, that I think is new. We've seen both the president and the vice president try to inject a purpose declassified statement about disinformation into both debates, the presidential debate and the vice presidential debate. They didn't do it very well, so it didn't catch on, but they tried. And that is really extremely worrying, because to put it really bluntly and in a nutshell, our conversation about disinformation has done more harm than the actual disinformation operation of 2016 itself.
Thanks, Tom. I appreciate that. I'm glad you raised the memo, the declassified memo. I think that was a tremendous, well, it was a tremendous disservice to the country and a really important example of disinformation. I would love to talk more about that. You raised a couple other issues that I'd love to explore as well down the line. This concept of the kind of recipient or the victim of disinformation, how we handle it, how we maybe unwittingly kind of perpetrate it. Is it from a lack of experience or kind of antibodies, for lack of a better word? What is the reason for that? You talked about that a little bit, which I also think is quite fascinating. So let's come back to a lot of that, and I appreciate everything you said there in those opening remarks. But now let me turn to our final panelist, Vera Zakem. Vera is a senior technology and policy advisor with IST, the Institute for Security and Technology. She's a recognized expert on Russian influence and disinformation, the impact that technology plays in society and democracy, terrorism, and human security and stability. Vera, if I'd like to turn over to you for a moment for your opening remarks. Maybe thinking ahead, if you could help us understand, how do you anticipate, given what Tom and Nell have said already, how do you anticipate our foreign and domestic even actors potentially adapting their techniques going forward, either between now and November or beyond?
And thank you, Mike, and just thrilled to be here with such an esteemed group of experts and panelists. So I'd like to actually start by tying to the point that Thomas just made in terms of the recipients of disinformation. A big part of why this works and why the actors in many ways have been forced to adapt their tactics is because we're so deeply polarized in our society, and we have a society, certainly in America, that it's deeply partisan. We're obviously seeing this in this election cycle, but this has obviously been happening before and will go on after November 3rd. You know, we've seen, certainly over the course of the last 4 years and even earlier, we can point to examples where various actors, right? So you have Russia, you have China, you have Iran, and non-state actors, whether it's QAnon, as well as partisan figures, including current the President of the United States, where they have actually literally adapted their tactics. You know, for example, it started initially as just, hey, we're just going to push, we're going to create content. Turned over to a lot to amplification. And by the way, the amplification is not just being created in Russia or another country. They're amplifying false narratives that are being created in America by Americans. So we have to look at that as well. And we've also seen recent examples in terms of different tactics that are being used, where certain adversaries have hired, intentionally, if you will, Americans, where Americans didn't know that they were being hired to write for disinformation sources. And in this case, I'm thinking of peace data. So again, the tactics have evolved, the tactics have changed, and they're going to continue to change, because what the actors do is they say, okay, well, if this works, let's do more of it. If it doesn't work, they'll switch and adapt. But the key to this is in anticipating, again, we can talk about the adaptation of the actors, but the reason it works is because of how fractured and polarized we are in our society. And as long as we have these divisions, there's more pokes to poke into, or more holes to poke into. So let me stop there. I know we'll talk also about countermeasures as well as what can be done about it. So.
Okay, great. Thank you, Vera. We'll definitely come back to countermeasures. I'm sure everybody's going to want to know, are there things that we can do, for example, in our daily lives or in our communities to help, right? Not everybody works in a big organization, so what can we do? I'll definitely come back to you on that. But actually, I'd like to turn back next to Tom. My next question is for you. Maybe if we can take a step back, I'd love to know more about, who are we talking about, right? Who are the main perpetrators of disinformation right now, and what do they want? What are they trying to achieve with their actions right now?
That was a question for me?
Yes.
The answer to this question is evolving. the main actors that we've seen in 2016, let me again start there because I think it's far more significant than what we see today in volume and reach and impact, were of course the Russian intelligence community with the hack and leak operation, and the Internet Research Agency, mainly with the troll activity, the internet fake accounts on social media. I think we tend to get the story the upside down in the sense that we often talk about social media first and hack and leak, WikiLeaks, intrusion activity second. Because in my estimate, and not just my view, but the data show, I think quite clearly that the hack and leak was the far more effective vector, not the social media interference, in contrast to what many people seem to think. But of course today that is different, because today we still haven't seen a hack and leak, but we have seen some social media activity from a range of actors, not just Russian contractors like the what's left of the research agency, but also Iranian domestic. I mean, just earlier this morning, Facebook took down domestic coordinated inauthentic behavior by a group that is related to Turning Point USA. So sort of group of young activists. So a lot of people are using these tactics today. It's difficult we have to be more specific. The problem is, these are related, these two observations, because we have exaggerated the impact of social media interference so much in 2016. And I'm happy to give you data if you're interested of why I think we exaggerated it. That has created a market. That has created the perception that there's something to be gained by playing this game. And a lot more actors have entered the marketplace of coordinated inauthentic behavior, if you want to use that Facebook term.
So first of all, I would absolutely love to have that data. If you're willing to share it, that would be great. Second, so if I understand correctly, if I can just stay on this topic for another minute, more actors have kind of flooded into the social media disinformation kind of stream of activity, but arguably it may not be as effective, or we haven't seen it be as effective as the hack and leak was. So it may not be as impactful as the other one, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay.
So let me give you two data points if you're interested. So when Twitter removed the IRA-related Internet Research Agency-related accounts, that was in the late summer of 2017. Facebook, roughly in the same time frame, took down the IRA assets on its platform and handed over information to the Senate, actually committees investigating the activity, House Intelligence Committee most notably. And what we saw there is that, for example, the follow account on Twitter that was given over, that we have on the public domain, the follow account of these accounts, was frozen in time at the time of suspension. But if we are really in an honest, data-driven way, ask the question, how effective was their election interference, then I'm really not interested in how large their following was 9 months after the election. I want to know how large were these accounts a month before the election, a couple of weeks before the election. So you can pull that information from the Internet Archive. It takes a little bit of work and it's not complete, but the volume of engagement that you get if you crunch the data, then if you weigh them, so to speak, that way, and cut off the tail of activity post-election, that is much, much, much lower in terms of volume. About difficult to put a precise number on it, but 1/3 to what we think it is across the board. And then, of course, there's the other feature. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was saying, thank you. Go ahead, finish your thought.
The other aspect is that in the coverage of the social media interference, and really, I even would lay some blame at the feet of the special counsel, Robert Mueller, and the way they handled the social media, the IRA indictments. They also used the aggregate data. They didn't do actually the hard data work in order to look at what do the pre-election engagement figures actually show. So let's take this very evocative example. There's this famous ad, the Jesus versus Satan arm wrestling ad that the IRA put out. Many of you may have seen it. Very graphically evocative. That's why it was used in the press coverage. That's why why so many of us know the ad. If you pull the actual statistics for that ad down from the House Intelligence website, it takes a bit of number crunching and funny grep work to pull it out of all the PDF files because it's not very well presented. You will find that that particular ad had 71 impressions and 14 clicks before the election. That's nothing.
Yeah, that's amazing. Wow, I had no idea. Okay, super insightful. Thank you very much for that. Can I build on that a little bit and actually turn over to Nell, over to you? Tom raised a couple interesting points, right? So it seems to me like you as CTO, and I know you mentioned Bob Lord as CISO of the DNC, you obviously have to deal with cybersecurity, right? Hacks, hack and leaks potentially, disinformation. And then I don't know how much this would fall in your purview, but kind of, good old fashioned voter suppression as well. So, if we kind of, stick with those two or three, what is the most concerning to you? And then how are you thinking about dealing with it, whether it be disinformation, cybersecurity, hacking, or honestly, even voter suppression?
Yeah, and I appreciate that you brought those topics together because it's something that we absolutely think about as being a entangled set of problems. It's one of the reasons that the technology team at the DNC encompasses security, and under security is disinformation, as well as IT, which is responsible, of course, for provisioning devices and accounts to our staffers, because we absolutely see these issues kind of coming up hand in hand, and in the ways that Thomas described about the hack and leak being incredibly impactful in a negative sense, and being kind of fodder for what then became the disinformation campaign. These two things were very much related. Similarly, we build technology around protecting voters from potential effects of suppression. So part of the technology team's mandate is to help record incidents of voter suppression at polling locations in order to make sure that we can track those, remediate them, and in some cases litigate them after the fact. So 100% these things are related and all part of kind of a common thread of outside actors, both foreign and domestic, trying to undermine trust in our electoral processes and trust in our democratic politicians. I think to address your question about what the largest concern is, I mean, I would say it is the fact that the threats we're seeing at this point are just as much domestic as they are foreign. And that is deeply troubling. I would be interested to hear Vera and Thomas's thoughts on the Harvard study that came out just a few days ago about mail-in voter fraud and the disinformation campaign around that. Part of that working paper, which came out of the Berkman Klein Center, talks about the fact that in the 2015 to 2018 period, the disinformation coming from the Donald Trump campaign, Fox News, and not necessarily random online bots, but actual mainstream media was actually far more influential in spreading false beliefs than some of the troll and clickbait work. And I think we're seeing a similar situation right now, and as this paper makes the argument for, around undermining trust in voting by mail or voting absentee. And the fact that we have, elected politicians, appointed political, politicians that are themselves vectors of disinformation and undermining our societal norms, that is incredibly difficult to combat when it's not just about China or Iran or Russia, but about other Americans. And so that is certainly an area that we're very focused on and very concerned about.
Can I just a quick follow-up on that? It's a great point about the distinction between foreign and domestic sources. Is there do you handle those two differently? Or is it even easy to tell, right? It could be that a domestic source could be backed by a foreign source, but is there any way that you can discern between the two, and do you handle them differently?
It's a great question. And I think this is where, again, the work that we do tends to be very much in the moment and not necessarily about post hoc analyses that can always untangle the who is behind any given narrative or any given specific post or example. So we don't tend to differentiate in how we treat them. We escalate and kind of ask for takedowns of any content we feel violates policy or any narrative that we feel like is rampantly spreading untruths. What is unfortunate is that social media platforms do differentiate between often foreign and domestic actors, in the sense that in particular Facebook has exempted politicians and campaigns from fact checking. And so therefore there's different standards being held up to different types of content on the platforms. That is true of who is saying the statement, is true of whether the statement is an ad or an organic post. And that type of inconsistency in what sort of content is spread on platforms can be incredibly confusing to the users of those platforms. So they know that there's some fact checking, it's not clear what is and what is not fact checked, it's not clear what the role of the platform is in fact checking. And all of that, I think, adds just a real kind of opacity and confusion for individuals who are just trying to understand what is happening, how to vote, where to vote, what a policy standard is, what the character of a politician is. And it's a really very murky area that we're looking at right now. So we basically treat any threat as a threat that we try to counter as best we can with the tools we can.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to take that and turn over to Vera. Vera, I'd like to give you an opportunity to either respond to the vote by mail study that Nell mentioned, but I'd also like to kind of build on her theme of the tech platforms. What are you seeing that's being done from your perspective that's being done differently, either by the platforms themselves in terms of policy, or are you seeing any kind of emerging technologies that are showing promise in this area? Anything like that you'd like to address?
Yeah, so thank you. So first, I do want to piggyback to what just Nell mentioned, and I think she's right on target here. There's so much emphasis on platforms and social media, and it's only, I feel like now there's more of an emphasis or attention really to the role that politicians, everyday people really, and mainstream media play in spreading both disinformation and misinformation. You know, without question, there's been enormous amount with mail-in voting, voter suppression, and let's also not forget about COVID, right? So just real quickly, just data point on that. Just in the last week, the president equated COVID and the deaths from COVID, we've had over 210,000 deaths, to the flu. And CDC released the data that last year, there were about 22,000 people who died from the flu. You can't equate the two. And what happens, just another tactic on disinformation, sometimes it's also not all 100% conspiracy theory or a lie. There sometimes can be a grain of truth in it. So when you can have the average person, the consumer of that information, seeing the president tweet that out, may look at, let's see, oh, maybe there's some truth to that. So I do want to point to that because, again, it's not just social media, it is mainstream media, it is political figures and important figures, and then it also, you know, trusted circles, if you will, friends and family, because they carry a lot of weight, and that's just kind of psychologically how we respond. On the platforms, I have seen a lot of movement, and I feel that, in broadly speaking, on the technology side, it's evolved. I think we have come leaps and bounds, if you will, from where we were in 2016 to where we are now on a couple of fronts. One is they're definitely across the board, they're erring more on the side of transparency and accountability, which is the right thing to do. It is not just the right thing to do for democracy, it is also good for their business, because the consumers and the users have the right to do of how they actually create policy, enforce that policy, and how they actually design the product to counter disinformation. So that's that. So there's positive movement. Is it all perfect? No, but there is positive movement in that. I have also seen new technology in terms of emerging technology that is being developed. There's certainly the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning to both identify the threat, but also create countermeasures and also facilitate that information sharing between the platforms, between the government and the consumers as well. And then also, of course, there's a lot of activity, I think, around fact checking as well. I think we're still, I haven't seen the full capability yet that is able to fact check, the technology that is able to fact check in real time. I think that's sort of the $1 million question and the $1 million solution, but I'm hopeful of that because it just feels like the environment that we're in right now, people want that because we're in this kind of information environment that we're just flooded by all of this information that's coming to us from all sides.
Thanks, Vera. You raised two things. Well, more than two things. Two things I want to reiterate. I think, and actually you and Tom both mentioned that the closer that you adhere to the truth, the more effective that piece of disinformation is likely to be, which makes a lot of sense to me. You can exaggerate it, you can tweak it here or there, you can turn it for different purposes, but the closer it adheres to the truth, the harder it is to tell that it's disinformation, and that resonates with me. But then you raised another issue that I think we raised at the beginning, which is this doesn't necessarily end at November. And Tom, I'd like to turn back to you real quick. So I'd like to get a sense for where you think the targets are going to evolve after November, right? I mean, in my impression, it's that our adversaries are attacking elections because they view them as weak points, right? They're attacking us at the joints. And so after the election, I can't imagine this is going to stop. So what happens next? Is it the census? Is it our alliances with NATO? Like, where is this going to go after November in your mind?
To come by. Sorry, it was a historian's joke. But if we take into account the tasking and the actors that we are up against, the most potent ones, then of course think about attacking the 2020 election before, during, or after the election from the point of view of a sophisticated intelligence agency. You can no longer simply do a leak via website and WikiLeaks because that venue is in some ways so suspicious and not really available to you anymore. You can't really do a lot of fake accounts on Twitter and Facebook anymore because they will be caught too quickly. These two companies have become much better at catching them quickly. You also know that the FBI and the entire US intelligence community is really watching very closely for operations that resemble anything done in the past. So you have to evolve top of the spear. I'm not talking about these noisy operations that are taken down all the time. So how do you attack the election if you even want to do it? And how do you continue afterwards? And I think they will have to try to think outside the box. And, for example, one thing that I'm really concerned about is that some form of an election infrastructure operation will happen, probably will not be very successful. But what's important in that moment, in that very stressful time around the 3rd of November, perhaps even on the day of, is to create the impression quickly that something isn't right. And then have that amplified by one side in the debate. I mean, it's obvious which side it will be here in the United States. So when that happens, then you have the confluence of an external foreign operation and politicization of that operation. And then there's ample precedent for that happening already. So that's a scary scenario. And then, of course, there's the issue of escalating physical violence inside the United States. Also, there are historical precedents for this kind of behavior. It's very aggressive. And of course, it's something that we have to be concerned about. But if any foreign actor would be, Russia, in all likelihood, will have a rather hostile administration, democratic administration to deal with if the election is coming out as it currently looks like. And first now, I'm not sure we're looking at a high appetite of risk right here.
You know, you raised a good point. I kind of think of elections almost like banks, right? And it's the faith of the system that matters almost as much as the actual security itself, which seems like the point that you're raising, right? An incident doesn't necessarily have to be successful if people believe that it'll shake the belief in the outcome, the faith in the outcome, and that will lead to strife, which I think is a powerful thing to say, right? I wonder, you know, we obviously need to talk about this, right? We need to grapple with it. We as a society need to realize that this is happening and think about what we can do about it. And maybe this is a question for everybody. How do we do that? How do we do what needs to be done to keep ourselves safe and secure and to stem the flow of bad information and allow the flow of good information, which would be the other side of this? How do we do that while also kind of not playing into the adversary's hands and making everybody so nervous that they don't have any faith in the outcome of the election to begin with? I know that's kind of an amazingly difficult question, but I'd love to at least try to get some ideas out there if we can. Maybe, you know, Tom, just stick with you for a second, and then Nell and Vera, if you'd like to weigh in, that'd be great.
Again, if I may bring in a sort of up-close example from 2016, because it's just interesting, especially in this environment where we have presumably some people from the DNC, not just on the panel, but also watching. And I mentioned earlier in passing that the DNC hack is a misnomer. Why did I say that? The DNC hack is a misnomer because obviously it was not just files from the DNC that became public. In fact, first and foremost, and when I say first, I literally mean first, it was John Podesta's inbox that was looted and put into the public domain on the 4th of June already. And again, in the first leak that was claiming to be from the DNC, but in fact was mined and populated with attachments predominantly from John Podesta's inbox. And worse than that, on the 16th of June, that day when Guccifer 2 started leaking, the Russian officers running that operation were falsifying documents. They were adding, you know, classification headers where there were none before. In the case of at least one document, they claimed it came from somebody else. They claimed it came from Hillary Clinton's machine in the State Department, which was factually incorrect. So why didn't nobody point this out? In hindsight, I think I was only able to notice this once we had the actual full loot coming out on WikiLeaks. But I mean, if you had access to insider knowledge, it should have been possible to point that out earlier, to point out that they are lying and that they're forging. Not completely, you know, the content, but enough to cast doubt on the leak itself. So I think in hindsight, and this will again, you know, become a major conversation if we start reflecting on those 4 years, assuming the Trump administration will be over at some point soon. I think we have to be really self-critical when we start that process of reflection.
Thank you, appreciate that. Nell, can we go to you, same question?
Sure. I mean, to pivot a little bit to the question of what kind of the average person can do in this area, I mean, I think it's not an easy question, and there are no easy answers because this is a really whole of society problem. And the things that we focus on and think a lot about are not going to sound like rocket science. You know, it is about making sure that everyone is educating themselves about the content they're consuming and amplifying, whether that's coming from social media, mainstream media, you know, friends and family. That there is certainly, I think, a heightened need for scrutiny and self reflection and kind of critical thinking. I think that it's actually very, very easy for anyone who's on social media to become a vector for disinformation kind of without even realizing it. And sometimes that's not about partisanship. That's just about, you know, the kind of very easy way in which we amplify the comments of others without first understanding the reasoning or motivation behind them. I would obviously also say, and I'm a partisan, so I think I'm allowed to, that we believe it's incredibly important at the DNC to vote for a new administration that will take seriously the threats we are facing, again, both foreign and domestic, around undermining confidence in our democracy. We think that is absolutely on the ballot this November. And so I would say that Americans need to vote for an administration that will believe in its intelligence community, will provide resources and support, and not add to the amount of confusion, misinformation, and doubt that is currently around this ecosystem. So those are some of the things I would suggest. Again, no easy solution there, certainly.
Perfect, thanks. And that actually brings up some of the audience questions as well, which I'm going to get to in a minute. A lot of people want to know, are we feeding into our adversaries' hands, even kind of by having this discussion, which is such an interesting needle to thread. But before we get to the audience questions here in a second, Vera, I'd like to go to you. Same question. How do we achieve that balance? And then, what are some things that you think we can do individually to, stop disinformation, essentially?
Yeah, so I 100% agree with Nell. This is a whole society problem, not one part, whether we're talking about platforms, media, government, civil society is the problem creator or has all the solutions. So it really is one thing is working together and creating better in terms of information sharing and collaboration. In terms of everyday, all of us really, we need to stay calm. That's the first and foremost, because when we're consuming when again this information is coming to us and we're already consuming so much of it, and we're still not at November 3rd, and we'll have to see what the period between November 3rd and the inauguration looks like, right? So we need to stay calm, because when we see these sensationalized headlines, we almost like psychologically, we get this emotional response. And that emotional response kind of elicits this kind of, we're going to like it, we're going to share it, we're going to retweet it, we're going to post on our timelines, we're going to go and tell it to our friends and family. So again, part of that is stay calm, step back a little bit, and do think about the information that you're consuming. Corroborate the data, corroborate the sources across the sources to make sure that the information that it is indeed truthful. And especially when it comes to election, when we're dealing with voting, there are places you can go for factual information, including your local election office, that hopefully folks have received their ballots. A lot of the ballots are being distributed by mail. Go to the local election office for that. If you are not 100% sure that the information you're receiving is correct specifically to the election. So again, just think critically a little bit more and corroborate those sources just for all of us.
Thanks, Vera. So if I'm hearing correctly, I think there are a couple different ways to answer that question. The first is, at a national level, you have to have a government that is willing to take this seriously and potentially even impose a cost on a foreign adversary so that they are somewhat deterred from undertaking this activity in the first place. There's also, elections are held at the state level, right? So there's a lot of state infrastructure and security that has to be done, with the help of the government, federal government, but also done by elections officials, secretaries of states, counties, et cetera. The tech companies arguably have a responsibility not to propagate information, especially in a responsible fashion. And at the individual level, it sounds almost like think before you click or something like that, right? Like these things are designed to get at you emotionally, before you just forward a tweet or a Facebook post or what have you. Think about what you're doing, and think about if you're being and maybe an unwitting kind of pawn in some kind of disinformation scheme. So that sounds like a lot of good advice. So with that, let me turn over to the audience questions. We have a bunch that have come in already, some of which you guys have already answered because you're amazing. But I'm going to go ahead and dive into some of the ones that have not been addressed. The first one looks like it's a historical question. So Tom, I'm going to turn this to you. The question is, what are historical examples of how active measures have been countered effectively?
So one of it sounds almost quaint and trite to say this, but the most effective way to counter active measures is through transparency, by getting the facts out quickly, by exposing operations, ideally supported by, forensic evidence, ideally even better defector accounts talking about what they did. And that is going to be counter the operation itself. For a long time, operators in the Soviet Union had the saying that an exposed measure is a dead measure. To some extent, that is no longer true because of the conversation about disinformation, the way it's been going. But yeah, exposure. And I think the CIA in the 1960s started to become better at exposing Soviet operations, and especially in the 80s, especially in congressional hearings through the record. Exposed operations that we can study and look at.
Okay, thank you. Next question looks like it's for Nell. Question is there any bipartisan effort between U.S. political parties to counter disinformation in the U.S. And or just generally recognize the issue? Question.
It's a great one. Yeah, there are some. I think that some of them are, the proof will be in the pudding. The one I would point to as I think the most promising is a nonpartisan group called Defending Digital Campaigns that works with both Republicans and Democrats, with the parties as well as vendors, to provide access to security tools and services for reduced costs in hopes of improving the security stance of both Democrats and Republicans. And they've been doing really phenomenal work. A huge supporter of what they're doing, and the fact that they're doing things like getting security keys into the hands of down ballot campaigns, both on the left and the right, making sure that some of the more expensive, best in class security vendors and consultants can be utilized by what is obviously always underfunded nonprofit groups that work in politics. So I think that's a great example, and I'm really impressed by what they're doing, and they've managed to do it, and I think in a really nonpartisan way. So I hope to see more things like Defending Digital Campaigns in the future.
Thank you. Next questions are actually several questions, same theme, also Nell, for you. That may be a little bit difficult to answer, but I'll give it a shot anyway. People just generally want to know, is the DNC under attack right now? Are you seeing a lot of, hacking attempts, a lot of major disinformation attempts, hacking leaks, anything like that that you're able and willing to discuss?
Oof, bringing the hard ones, man. Yeah, I think I'll deflect.
There's like 6 of them in a row, like all the same question.
I'll deflect on anything, on saying anything kind of on the record here. But I mean, I will say that I don't think it'd be surprising to anyone that we are constantly under scrutiny, and we are constantly doing everything we can to improve our security posture. If Bob Lord was here, he would say that, we can never, fully prevent any sort of intrusion or attack. All we can do is constantly reduce our surface area for attacks and constantly improve our ability to monitor and detect intrusions. But the reality is we are in a political environment where there is constant attacks coming, I think, for both the left and the right. In terms of disinformation, I think that it's also pretty public knowledge that there is constant disinformation narratives flowing online. Again, some of those coming from the president's own mouth about things like, as Vera said, the realities of COVID and its effect on our society, as well as how to vote securely and effectively right now. So the generic answer is yes.
Thank you. Appreciate the candor. Vera, can I turn to you? You talked about this a little bit already, but maybe you can expand. The question is, are there technical solutions to this problem, specifically to countering nation-state active measures?
I mean, again, in terms of the technical solutions, we can talk about it. In this one, I would actually say the technical solutions, they're going to be limited. And I'll tell you why. Yes, we can talk about fact checking. We can talk about IDing the threat. We can also, and I do know and see some startups, they're using both AI and ML technology to create that information sharing, meta information sharing between various government, tech platforms and other entities as required, and making sure that that information is pushed forward for countermeasures. But in this case, when we talk about especially foreign adversaries, you can also make the case for domestic, it is not just about technological solution. We have to go back and to address the societal problems that exist in our societies, whether it's here in the United States or in many countries around the world. And that includes actually building resilience, societal resilience. So the society and our institutions and the people, the citizens, are less likely to be manipulated by foreign or domestic adversaries. That's where the rub is, in my opinion. So yes, technology we really can harness technology in this endeavor. And I anticipate we're going to see a lot more of it, but we cannot do it completely, just 100% focus on the tech side without also focusing, and also the tech can be also a big solution proponent of this, in actually strengthening the resilience aspect of it.
Next question, you actually mentioned this, Vera, and I think actually most of you have mentioned it, fact checking. Great idea. What are some good places for people to go for fact checking today? If you have any favorite or recommended sites or resources, I'd be happy to know. Maybe Nell, we'll stick with you, and then Tom and Vera, if you guys have any you'd like to add as well.
In terms of resources, I will just point out two very quickly, so everyone has a chance. So one is on general resources around disinformation. I would suggest dnc.org/disinfo, where we link out to a variety of other resources. In particular, I would say there is a link there about legislation, there's a link there about general public education, and there's a link there about a comparison of policies across social media companies and what they are and are not currently regulating, more or less self-regulating. The other resource I would point to, and just to build off of, I think the excellent point Vera made earlier about educating yourself about voting information, you definitely should be going to your own state's Secretary of State website, but I'd also suggest iwillvote.com as a resource that has links again out to a variety of ways you can vote by mail, vote early in person, and educate yourselves about options within your state. So those are the two I'll leave you with.
Great, thank you. Tom, anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I'll add a provocation to it. Fact checking is obviously much harder in practice often than it looks like. So let me give you an example. Saying the statement that there is overwhelming evidence that there was Russian election interference in 2016, that is not a controversial statement on the left, and in the center, it's controversial on the right. But the provocation is the other one that's coming next. There is no good evidence that this election interference had any meaningful impact on the outcome of the election itself. That is factually a correct statement. But a lot of people on the left find it very controversial because the idea has taken hold that Russian interference has had a significant impact on the outcome of the election and potentially is responsible for Trump becoming president. Now, here is, countering disinformation means also staring this ugly truth in the face. The truth is, if we collectively decide that this Russian operation was effective without good evidence, then we are becoming a little bit like Russia, where we blame domestic problems on foreign interference without good evidence.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Very good point. Thank you. And then Vera, we're looks like we have about a minute left, so can we make this the wrap-up response? Any recommendations on fact checking or anything else? And then I'll turn it over to Phil for closing remarks.
First of all, plus 1,000 to what Thomas just said. Without evidence, we become victims of spreading disinformation. The evidence is key to all of this. That's first. Second, there are a lot of resources as well. Pointer Institute is one example. There's a lot of been also independent news sites. First Draft News is another one. That's a really, really good one. And there's a lot of collaborations, I would like to say, fantastic collaborations actually across the nonprofit and academic communities, organizations that are actually partnering together to not only show sort of or dispel disinformation and truth, but also to show what the policies are about various platforms and also give tips to folks what they can do about it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Vera. I'd like to say thank you to the whole panel. You guys have been terrific. I think we were actually just getting warmed up. We probably could do this for another hour. Thanks as well to the audience. I think I got through a third of the questions, maybe less. So been a highly active and interested audience, and thank you very much for joining. Let me stop there. I'm going to turn things back over to Phil, who will close us out. Phil?
Yeah, and thank you to Mike for hosting and moderating this event. Thank you to our speakers, to Thomas Red, to Nell Thomas, to Vera Zakem. This is such a critical conversation right now. We will continue the conversation as part of our election security initiative. Get in touch with us, get on the website, reach out. I think one of the most fascinating pieces of this, right, is what happened after 2016. There was so much discussion about how little was done. And now there's so much conversation, I think, Thomas, you got after it, that we're overblowing it, that it's actually contributing to the active measure by almost selling it on their behalf. This is a tense conundrum that we have to deal with as a society. How much do you say? How much do you do? How do you actually grapple with this? I think it's a whole of society discussion. It's a whole society initiative that has to be undertaken by all of us. So let's work together on this. Thank you to everyone who's joined us here today. Really look forward to hearing from you and continuing this discussion and trying to do something about this collectively to try to protect American democracy. Thank you all for joining us. We'll be in touch.